So my name is Amanda Lynch and I am the organiser for today's event. So my description is I'm a white female with glasses, with long-ish black hair and a red burgundy jumper. So I'd just like to start by thanking everyone joining us today for Quality Disabled Seminar. I'd like to mention that Quality Disabled is supported by the British Art Network, BAN. BAN is a subject specialist network supported by the Tate and the Paul Mellon Centre for studies of British art with additional public funding provided by the National Lottery through Arts Council England. The network promotes curatorial research, practice, theory in the field of British art. Its members include curators, academics, artist researchers, conservators, producers and programmers at all stages of their professional lives. The link will be able to, for the British Art Network will be in the chat box soon. Before we start, I'd like to do just a little bit of housekeeping. Please can all participants stay muted with your videos off to avoid any disruptions. For those who need BSL interpreters mode is switched on and should be visible on your screen now. Please do use the raise hand icon, which is at the bottom of your screen under reactions if you need assistance, or pop a message into the chat box. Please make sure you have your full name displayed within the Zoom and not an alias. This allows ease with identifying you. I encourage you to ask questions throughout the day. This can be done either within the chat box feature or in the Q&A session by using the raise hand icon. If you are using the chat box with a question but are happy to speak to the panel, please type happy to speak next to your question. This way we can make sure you get the chance to speak directly to the panel. Today's seminar, as mentioned, is recorded. We also have captions available if needed. We are joined by two BSL interpreters, Emily Howlite, give us a wave, Emily, and Ali Gordon, who's also interpreting for us now. Today's Zoom is facilitated by Disability Arts Online. Joanne Connolly will be monitoring the Zoom and chat, and Joanne, give us a wave if you're there. Brilliant. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of the panelists for joining us today, and I, for one, am extremely excited to hear from each and every one of you. I'd like to now hand over to Colin Hambrook from Disability Arts Online, who will be introducing this morning's speakers. Over to you, Colin, and thank you.
Hi, thanks, Amanda. I'm Colin Hambrook. I'm the founding editor of Disability Arts Online. I'm an older white man with glasses, and I'm looking at myself and thinking those ears are far too big, but that's what happens when you get older. So I'm wearing glasses and I've got a red fleece on, and I'm especially looking forward to this session today, talking about disability and art education. I spent 10 years trying to get into art school, failing miserably because I had a passion to make socially engaged arts about mental health critique, psychiatric system. At the end of at the sort of end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, I eventually got into Dartington, who were the only art college in the country that were interested in socially engaged practice. And I got a 2-1 BA honours, and then spent another 5 years trying to get into art school to do an MA, and just constant rejection, which is why I'm here today hosting Disability Arts Online, because that was the only way I could go, was to challenge the ableism, which is so embedded in every fabric of society, and especially within education. And I'm really pleased to introduce an old colleague and friend, Mike Claywood, who's a stalwart of the disability arts movement. And Mike was the artistic director of Disability Arts Shropshire for 23 years, and only recently moved on to be a freelance artist and an art student. And so, Mike, I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Please pin mic and welcome.
Hi, Colin. Thanks for that intro. Lovely to see you. And yeah, it's an interesting story that you say there, because mine is the opposite way round, that now that I've hit 70, 71, in fact, I'm become an art student. So I've just a quick description, then I'll open my PowerPoint. So I'm Mike Laywood. I'm an older white man, but I'm Jewish, not practicing. And I've got glasses, not a lot of hair, not exactly bald, but I've got some straggly grey hair. I've got a shirt on that is a pattern shirt, so it's got a lot of different colours. So I'll start my screen share because that will give you some ideas, but I will need someone probably 2 minutes before the end of my 20 minutes just to give me a quick warning, because this is a very wide-ranging, almost rambling presentation about my personal experience and my thought about assessments and exams and that whole system. So here is the PowerPoint. Yep, I'll just put it on full screen. Okay. So what we're going to go through today is reflections on the assessment of quality as a disabled art student. So that's a very subjective, personal view. How do you objectively assess artwork in an art school? Good question, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer that. What is the history of assessments in education? I'm going to give a very thin overview, but interestingly, the next speaker is Claire, who's an academic, and she will give a much more knowledgeable view about assessments, because she's been having to obviously do that as an academic. Then, is there another way? Where does this leave disabled art students? So you can see we've got quite a lot to get through. So I'll tell you a story about how I came to begin to understand how students are assessed in art schools. Last year I was doing an art foundation at Hereford College of Arts, which is a great small art school. It's about maybe 6 or 7 art schools that are independent, are left now. I mean, there were hundreds of them in small towns all over the country. I'd estimate that probably 25% of the students are disabled or neurodivergent. And I'm sure that's for many reasons. One of them, that it's a small size, is only maybe 250, 300 students, and it's not based in a big city. So that makes an interesting cohort, but it doesn't mean to say that it's some wonderfully sussed, non-ableist college. So last year, the foundation was great. Anyone who's done a foundation will have found them very playful. And I just loved learning and playing with art until we came to the last big project. And then for some reason that no one explained to us, it was going to be graded. Up to then, all you got was a pass or a fail. And to fail meant you didn't turn up. You didn't do anything. If you were turned up, put in a few drawings, you would pass, because it wasn't meant to be assessing you in that way. But suddenly we had this fail, pass, merit and distinction. And suddenly the atmosphere changed. People got very stressed. They wanted obviously to get the best grade they could. Though who would ever ask you if you said, I did a foundation, what grade did you get? But it has an effect, because we're all used to this idea of going through exams and being assessed. So immediately it comes up, you want to do the best, because if you don't, you feel like you're failing. So a lot of the students on the foundation had only just left school or college. So they were young, and I realized then that they'd been assessed from the age of 7 once they started with SATs. And it become embedded in their thinking that assessments were just part of life, whether you liked it or not. So I had a very complex criteria, and I tried not to care about it. But of course, we're conditioned. So I sort of found myself thinking, oh, what will I do? And I realized that my way of recording information in my sketchbook, we had this small group tutorial with 3 other students, and their sketchbooks were immaculate. They were so tidy, they were really neat. They had a very linear, chronological order of their thinking. They'd downloaded loads of photos off the internet, stuck them in really neatly. The whole thing really told their story of their thinking. And mine was not like that. I'd been making a film. I didn't work with a storyboard. I just went down to the river that I was filming and just saw what I saw that was interesting to me. I would start making clips from that, and then the clips would go together to make the film. But I didn't know what I would do till I'd finished and started editing. So I didn't want to work with a storyboard because it was a different process. And I thought, should I go back to my sketchbook and start recording this in there? But it felt really phony. Why do I need to? Because in fact, the film's going to tell the story that I want to tell. But I did realize that I wasn't going to meet the criteria if I did that. And once I'd gone through that small tutorial, I thought, oh, okay, I've got a choice here. And I thought, no, I felt really angry about it. So this is what my response was. I started making these in my sketchbook, being as messy as I could, wrote this piece. I am so oppressed by neat and tidy art, sketchbooks that are laid out as every piece is considered. Creativity is not neat and tidy. Humans are not neat and tidy. I'm sure a lot of you would agree, but maybe not all. Fascism is neat and tidy. The military are neat and tidy. I knew that probably would not go down well. I get on well with my tutors, but I just had to do something to not be oppressed. What I felt was what is not a neurotypical way of working, was just having to be, I either chose to be forced into this situation or not. So I didn't. So not surprisingly, if you rebel against something, you don't get patted on the back. I got a pass, which is fine. No one is going to say, oh, you only got a pass. But yeah, very, very strange. And it made me then think a lot about it. And I asked, why did we have this assessment? And then the college told me that the organization who accredit the foundation, which is University Arts London, set the criteria. But if they didn't set criteria for the foundation, they wouldn't get the funding for the foundation from the government. So I started to realize that you go up the food chain and you end up in the government, who are really trying to control education. And if you look at Gove, his whole principles around education are really, well, go back to the time I was at school, where everything was exam-based. If you could remember facts, you passed exams, you went on okay. If you didn't, then you were a failure. It was all very polarized and very black and white. So maybe some of you remember this. This is a really old advert, which was about something called Home Pride Self-Raising Flour. So it's a picture with a black and white bag of flour with a bigger and a smaller man, both with black bowler hats. And then alongside it says, graded grains make finer flour. So the whole thing about this advert is that you take the lumps out of the flour and you grade it down and down till you get really fine flour. And that makes the best cakes, the best bread. And made me think, so us disabled people, disabled artists, are we the lumps that have to be graded out? So when I did my MA in Leeds, so I did an MA before I did a degree. I was very lucky to get onto it. And I think they took a risk. And it was in activism and social change. So it was run by a group of academic anarchists. So I probably put them in a difficult position because I worked on my experience of working for Dash and my history as an artist and as an activist. And I didn't know about people like Paulo Freire But once I started reading, and I worked with a theatre group in Birmingham called Banner Theatre, who'd been using his methods of education, I started to understand a wider view of education and some of the people who've been challenging it for a long time. So Paulo Freire, he was Freire. He was born 1921. He died in 1997. He was a Brazilian educator, philosopher, and Marxist. He spent 16 years in exile while Brazil was run by the military. There'd been a military coup. So he spent time in America, in Canada, and in Europe. And his book, famous book, is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So the slide has a picture of probably him in his later years. He has a beautiful silvery beard. He has glasses. He's got probably about the same amount of hair as I have. He's darker skinned, and he's just staring at the camera. So one of his big things was the banking model of education. And it's a sort of obvious thing, but he put it into a system, and I think that really helped people to understand. So this slide says the banking model of education, an approach where students are viewed as passive recipients of knowledge and teachers act as depositors of information into their minds. So the overview is the banking model of education emphasizes a one-way flow of information from teachers to students, focusing on memorization and reproduction of facts rather than critical thinking or active involvement in the learning process. This model is often criticized for fostering a hierarchical relationship, inhibiting students' agency and neglecting the development of critical thinking skills. So examples are traditional lecture format. In a lecture-based class, the teacher delivers information to passive students who expect to take notes and memorize the content. And then standardized tests often reflect the banking model of education by assessing students' ability to recall and reproduce factual information. So I don't know if Freire said this or someone else put it, but they said that exams are almost like the students vomiting up all the stuff that's been stuffed into them. And there's plenty teachers, lecturers who don't work like that, but this model that there's the teacher imparting the facts to the students as if they're empty vessels to be filled. And what he was proposing was an equal where the teachers have things to teach to the students, but the students also have things to teach to the teachers, and it's an exchange of information and understanding, and it becomes a much more active and progressive way of working. He brought up the popular education of people, and he uses the word popular as of the people. So that was used in Venezuela when Chavez, after the sort of revolution that happened there, there's quite a few Latin American and South American countries using his form of education. And there's an interesting story that I thought showed, he did a lot of work with literacy, with people who couldn't read, and particularly in Brazil at that time, you couldn't vote if you were non-literate, if you didn't read. And he realized that for people to learn to read, it had to start from where they were, what their culture, what their understanding of the world was. If it was imposed from a different cultural perspective, it wouldn't mean anything and it wouldn't stick. And so they were able in his literacy schemes to teach people really quickly how to read. And there was a story, the next person, Augusto Boal, worked with him in Peru in a slum area, and they gave out old film cameras to a group of people, including, there was a child there, about 8 or 9, to go off and make some photos of what oppression meant to them. What does oppression mean to you? And one person filmed the open sewer outside their hut that meant that their children were regularly ill. But this one young boy, he came back with a picture of a hook on a wall, and everyone laughed and said, well, what's oppressive about that? And then he told his story about going in, him and the other boys who were shoeshine boys, they had to walk 2-3 miles into the center of the town or the city, carrying their equipment. And well, they didn't carry the equipment. The thing was, it was just too far for them to walk carrying their equipment. So they had to hire a hook in a barber's shop. So they had to pay a certain amount of money to put their equipment there each day. So that meant that a certain amount of their time each day was just paying for the rent of this hook. So to him, the hook was a real part of his oppression. And he would then, Friere, and would use things like that to start using words from these photos that people had taken that were reflected from their personal lives. And Augusto Boal, similar, another Brazilian who was in exile during the military coup, and he created the theatre of oppression, of the oppressed, and his ideas were influenced by Friere. And he came up with a democratic view of theatre. How could theatre mean something and actually a chance for people to come together to use it as a problem-solving method? And I think he was really influenced by sort of Greek theatre that was much more based around the people. And he came up with forum theatre where there would be a discussion on what subject people wanted to see a piece of theatre on. The actors would create a piece of theatre, and then it would be replayed, and everyone in the audience could stop it at any time. They could take over a character and try and change the story, or they could say, no, that's not how I think it should be. And I've only seen it a couple of times, but it was not like a normal theatre show. It was there was just so much going on. It wasn't really, he doesn't call the audience, he called them spectators, so that they're not a passive spectator, they're actually active participants in it. So another way is possible. We don't have to have the assessment system. And there have been moments in fairly recent time where people have challenged it, and it obviously hasn't changed, but it has been questioned. So one big moment was Paris 1968, which was a massive, massive rebellion. And it started because the French higher education system had expanded really rapidly, and it didn't have the facilities and the staff to deal with all the extra students. So people were in poor facilities, they weren't seeing tutors enough. And the initial issues were around about male and female students being able to sleep with each other, to share each other's accommodation. There was segregated accommodation, and it was challenging what wouldn't seem an issue now, but it was a very patriarchal system. And so that was where things started, but very quickly it led to occupations of colleges, which then the police were called in. It led to riots with violent police repression. That led to workers coming out on strike in support of the students. And things went really wobbly in France then. The General de Gaulle, who was the president then, and he'd been someone way back in the war, like Churchill, he'd led Free France. So he had this respect, but he was patriarchal. He was a very conservative man. He was a military man. He'd fled the country, and no one really knew what happened then. He went to see, I think, a general in Germany, and it felt like France was on the edge of a revolution, and it didn't happen for many, many different reasons, but it certainly sent ripples around the world. In that time, in 1968, there were so many student occupations in Japan, so many in America, and here in Britain as well. So it was a really influential time. So, I'll just go back one, because, oh no, it's okay. I'll come on to this in a minute, but here in this country, Hornsey Art School and Guildford Art School were two that were both occupied. And at Hornsey, they said one of the things that they wanted to do was they argued for the elimination of GCE entrance qualifications, and they rejected examinations in art history and general studies. So they were really against having the exam system put into art education. The other things were more about their time, but they also there'd been a big expansion as well. They were in different facilities, and they had a really repressive setup where they couldn't leave a building until a certain time, and they had people on the door saying, you can't go now. So they weren't being treated like adults at all. They occupied, and their demands weren't met. And in some ways, I don't think they failed. I think a lot was learned again. And similar in Guildford. I mean, Guildford was actually a much more unpleasant one because a lot of lecturers were sacked, and there were a lot of students who were expelled. But it's important to know that these things have happened. And also that time, I can remember reading about, I think, Oxford or Cambridge students going into their finals and tearing up their exam papers and walking out. And so there was a time when people were really challenging, do we need exams? There's a little quote here from the Art Monthly I thought was very apt here, that art education in the UK and other countries has been taken over by neoliberal values that attempt to turn artists into human capital, subsequently emerging into a precarious universe where everyone is a separate unit, competing with everyone else, fighting to survive. So I think all of you will feel that, especially that last bit, that you're isolated and then you're out there fighting to survive. So A.S. Neill, an important person around, and one of the things, I'm not going to apologize, but the people I've been showing are men, and I'm sure that there are plenty of women I could have shown around libertarian education, but I don't personally know them, so I really like to find out who they are. So here's a picture of a man, probably in his 70s, flat cap on his head, thick overcoat. It looks very cold. I think it would probably be the 1930s, it might be 40s. He's in front of an old building, several cars. So A.S. Neill and Summerhill. So Summerhill was a school that he set up in 1921, so a long, long time back. And it was a response to his experiences of teaching in state schools in Scotland. He wanted to create a school in which the children would be happy, would have no fear, would be able to choose and how what they learn, would be able to play as much as they wanted, would be able to express and share their emotions and creativity, and would be able to control their lives through democratic meetings. Because that really goes back to actually how little we are taught how to be part of a democratic society and express opinions. In fact, the opposite. And that's why we end up with governments like we've got. One of the things he said was, books are the least important apparatus in a school. All that any child needs is the 3 R's. The rest should be tools and clay and sports and theatre and paint and freedom. Most of the schoolwork that adolescents do is simply a waste of time, of energy, of patience. It robs youth of its right to play and play and play. It puts old heads on young shoulders. And he would have written that quite a long time ago. I worked for a year in a primary school, and there was one teacher there, it was in Hackney, and she could have gone to Summerhill to teach, but she didn't, because it was, people had to pay to go to Summerhill. It wasn't state funded. Surprise, surprise. She wanted to work with children who wouldn't go to a school like Summerhill. And her classroom was like, you could never tell where she was because there were just groups of children running around doing different projects, and it was a buzz of energy. But you could go to the next classroom and all those children were in straight rows in desks, the teacher up front, and no sound at all. So it was a strange time. That was the early 70s, where progressive education was in and out of particularly primary education. Also that time, there was free schools were being set up. And it's interesting because when you hear the word free school now, it's like academies. It's not the word, why the word free is in there, I don't know. So these were set up on basically anarchist principles in working class areas. The one I visited was Scotland Road Free School in Liverpool. And the kids mostly only came in for lunch. They had a bloke who was the cook who worked on ships, and he was a Marine, you know, he had been a merchant sailor, and he'd been a cook on ships, and he used to do a big lunch. Kids would come in, some would stay, set up a lesson, but mostly they'd come in and the school was like a part of their day. And the two people who set it up, they said the school will be a community school, totally involved with its environment, the vanguard for social change. And it certainly was. They had groups visiting from all around the world. It was seen as a social experiment. And it survived for about a year or two. It didn't survive. Summerhill, I think, is still going. But the free schools did influence a lot of people. And this is really relevant. Open School East in Margate. It's an art school, but it's an art school that is different. It was established in 2013, located in Margate. Open School East is a free, independent art school and community space that focuses on collective learning through the arts. We support cultural practitioners at an early stage of their career to develop and sustain their practice and enable young people and adults alike to learn new and transferable skills, develop their confidence and shape their creative voices by becoming active learners and co-producers of our programs. So there's a picture here of, it's a very beautiful building, an older building, and that's in Margate. And I spoke to a disabled artist who went there, who I think is here at the webinar, and she was saying there were a lot of meetings, but they did work as a group, as a collective. There was a lot of discussions, and there was a lot of empowerment because they pretty much the students ran the course. They chose who would come in and do lectures for them, bringing in outside artists. And there was no qualification, it wasn't assessed. And so it was a really different thing. It wasn't free, but they only came in for 2 days a week to give enough time for students to do other jobs so that they could, they wouldn't exclude poorer students who didn't have another income or savings. So that is possible. It is possible to do this without going through this.
Butting in, Mike. We're coming to
okay
of time.
Well, I did my last little bit, which isn't on here, is a manifesto or a question to artists. So this question is it not the work of an artist to question, to challenge, to educate, to unsettle and upset the norm? And I think all of this, though I haven't mentioned disabled artists and neurodivergent artists or neurodivergent students or artists, but all of this is really relevant because I feel the impact of assessments is felt really strongly by disabled and neurodivergent people and excludes so many of us. That's it. And I hope that is not twirled your mind around too much this early in the morning.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. That just
stops sharing.
It makes me think of a lot of it just resounds in so many different ways, and kind of my own journey into disability arts. I got into disability arts because it's about real stuff in real life. It's and that to me is what quality should be about. Quality is about work that speaks to you as a human being, that speaks to the human condition, and that says something poignant and meaningful. And as you say, also sort of interrupts the values, the received values of society. I wonder, you know, going back to the question of quality, what and your work as a student now, what does it mean to you within, you know, the practice that you're developing?
Yeah, it's an interesting word, quality, because it's such a heavy lump of metal, isn't it? That what do you judge yourself against? And obviously we realize that one of the things that happens in the art world, especially once you move into galleries, is you're being judged against the art canon and all of that. And I just feel that any student just wants to make work, and quality would be one, if it's a 3D piece, it doesn't fall apart too quickly, that it's expressing something from inside. It's not just an empty piece of work. But on top of that, I can still feel this battle of sort of against the making work that's representational against work that is abstract. And this battle seems to, maybe it will always go on, but it feels still really strong. And against it, I think, is a lot of stuff that we've been brought up with from young, that what is judged as quality in art is, when we're young, is representational. All the kids at school, particularly in primary, but even into secondary, were the ones who could do great cartoons. And if you did something that was weird, people just think, well, that is strange, even though it could be similar to a Picasso. So I think there's another bit of, it's more than ableism, but something there that we trips us up all the time about judgment of quality.
Yeah, yeah. What we need is a kind of a shift from that idea of representation to rather than, you know, this sort of flat kind of idea of the world, is representation of what it means to be a human being and what it means to be, you know, animals, to be part of nature.
Yeah.
There have been some comments in the chat that I should probably relay. We have a comment here from Laura Porter, who said, "I'm so excited and enthused hearing Mike Laywood speak. I'm a musician with acquired physical disability, now relaunching myself into inclusive music education and community music. Before becoming disabled, I'd completed an MA looking at perceptions of professionalism in music. The topic of today's seminar would have been an amazing chapter for my thesis. I love Mike's observations about the teaching and learning experience, not least because it makes me feel my own thoughts to date are valid. So very glad to be here."
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura.
It's also great to hear about community music, because I think community music, I knew it way back when it was first starting, and it's probably really supported a lot of marginalized artists because of the way it works. And it's the same thing about a collective, not an individualization. And it's worked with such a range of people, community music. And I know a lot of musicians who have become great educators through training with community music. So great to hear it's still going.
The other, there was a question here about from Rachel Newby. She asked, she said she loves the details of the master's degree that you mentioned, and I think she asked, yeah, what if you could repeat where it was, and if it still be going.
I think it's still going. It's at Leeds University in the geography department, which is quite odd, but I think there's a history of human geography, which is a really interesting thread that's quite radical, looking at the impact between people and nature and the geography of wherever we're based. So the activism and social change, it was more, sometimes it felt like it was in Berkeley University in California in 1968. We would get people like vacuum cleaner came in, and he'd said, oh, well, I'll show you quickly what I do, but we need to go out and do it. So we went down to a bookshop and moved books around. We went into a Primark and started praying to the sunglasses. And it was, so it was the first year they'd run it. And I think it's still going. I hope it's still going. There was a lot of criticism within the activist movement that, are you trying to professionalize activism? So are these MA students going to come out and say, now we're the ones who should be the vanguard because we've got the stamp that says we're we've got the MA, you haven't, which didn't happen. But I think there's always that worry that you can create you start to, make a hierarchy.
That is a key issue, isn't it? That's a key problematic around quality.
Yeah, but Leeds University, have a look.
Leeds University, yeah. We need to move on fairly swiftly, but there are a couple more comments here. And I haven't got the name of the person who said this, but Dorothy Mead was one woman who was interested in more radical approaches to teaching art. She was a student of David Bomberg's at Borough Polytechnic, now London South Bank Uni, and was one of the Borough group. And when she went on to the Slade, she rebelled against the Slade's approach to making students learn perspective drawing, etc. She later became an art teacher herself. So that's an interesting bit of history.
Is that spelled N-E-E-D, Need, as in?
Mead, M-E-A-D.
M-E-A-D, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. I've written that down.
Thanks ever so much, Mike. As a nice segue here, Claire, who's our next presenter, says, thanks, Mike. Some great provocations. There are real tensions when we put art into education as well as opportunities. It's an odd thing, isn't it? Because, as human beings, art is one of the key tools for learning. And yet, as soon as we start kind of layering that kind of those hierarchical values, it sort of becomes something else. Yeah. And I think these conversations are really, really important to keep going. And so yeah, thanks for that very much, Mike.
My pleasure.
Just to let anyone know, the recording of these presentations will be available afterwards on request. If you want to email Amanda, we can provide a link to watch again. Let's move on now, because next up we have the wonderful Claire Penketh, who it's been my privilege to have worked with on quite a few occasions now, as being involved with the anti-ableist pedagogy group and kind of various outlets that Claire's involved with at Liverpool Hope Uni. Claire's Professor of Disability Studies and Art Education and Head of Disability Studies at Liverpool Hope. And she's a core member of the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies and principal editor of the International Journal of Art and Design Education. Claire's a member of the National Society for Education in Art and Design Education, NSEAD, who I've had the privilege to write for their wonderful quarterly publication, AD magazine. And yeah, thanks, Claire, for putting me in touch with Sophie Leach, and it's great to be part of that. And Claire, as I said before, heads up the special interest group on anti-ableist pedagogy. So great to have you on this seminar today, Claire. I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Colin. Thank you. It's great to be here, and I will share my screen. Just before I do, I'm a white female. I've got a brown jacket on. I've got grey hair, and I'm wearing black framed glasses. There's a picture on the wall behind me, which is part of some work that I did as my MA artist teacher. So I am an art educator. I don't work directly in art education, apart from in the roles Colin's mentioned. But this talk really is based on my experiences teaching in secondary art education for 13 years before I went to work in university. So let me just share my screen. We'll make a start. So I'm hoping somebody will tell me if that is okay. So thank you, and thanks to Mike for setting up some really important ideas around notions of quality, and through his direct personal experiences. It did remind me of the starting point for my work. When I started my PhD, I was interested in the relationship between coordination, specifically in art education. And I'm just going to read very quickly my own reflections on my art education. And a key turning point, the reason why I didn't decide to continue to O-level in art was for the reason of assessment, I think. So this is my recollection, and apologies to the signers here because I didn't send this information. So I just wanted to include it now. We had to draw a jam jar full of random objects for our exam. Splinters of wood stuck in my back teeth as I bit through my pencil. I can still feel the sheer frustration of trying to make that drawing. Miss Nicely looked up from the front desk, smiling encouragement. I got a B for that drawing. A B's okay, but it's not an A. I didn't continue with art and design past that third year. Now, I have gone on to do a whole range of other things in relation to art education, one of those being an MA artist teacher, and I would describe myself still as an artist teacher. So I engage in my own practice, and in doing so, that helps me to think through some of these issues, and in particular, the relationship between art education and disability. So following the invitation from Amanda to contribute to this session, I'm going to focus specifically on art education in compulsory education and the potential for ableist standards to underpin judgments regarding quality through assessment practices. I loved Mike's presentation and his conversational style, and I apologise that I'm going to need to read this presentation. Before I start, I just want to make a note of a clear distinction between art education and arts practice. And there's someone called Gert Biester who argues that art education is neither art, in that it's become subject to instrumental justification, nor is it education. And Biester explains that beliefs about art education that engage purely in self-expression without engaging with the quality of what is being expressed reduces the educational ability of art. So I'll throw that in the mix. With that in mind, though, we can still explore the relationship between disability and art and judgments regarding quality and therefore ability in the context of art education. I'm arguing that this might inform us in some way about the dominant ideas and ways of thinking that underpin ableist assumptions about disability and arts practice more generally. So we can ask questions here, sorry. So how might judgments regarding ability affect disabled students and pupils specifically? And do such judgments impact on later experiences? I argue, though, that this raises a further question regarding ability and the perceived relevance of art education. If a majority of people perceive ability in art as a narrow and specific set of abilities, then art education itself can become marginalised and reduced in its relevance to a group whose abilities fit within a narrow concept of arts practice. And that is a really significant issue for art educators, particularly confronted with this idea that people don't want to do art or can't engage in art education, for example, because they think that they can't draw, because we're working with very narrow ideas about what drawing might actually be. So I'm going to start in addressing the relationship between disability, art and education and the formation of ableist assumptions. I have to start here, and anybody who has heard me talk about things in the past, I'm conscious that I might just continue to go on about this relationship, but I think it's absolutely fundamental when we're thinking about school art education. So I describe this as the number one ableist assumption. Disability plus art education must always equal special educational needs. And I'm questioning that. I argue that the dominance of the SEN discourse has limited the social and cultural imagination in art education. Within this discourse, disability always equals additionality, need, specialness, therapy, something to be overcome. Here, art practice emerges despite rather than with impairment. There is a further tension though. Art educators and advocates for art education cite its universal value where they talk about art for all, despite any real interrogation of what all might mean. Art education is promoted for its ability to save the world, or at least save our young people from the catastrophic impact of poor mental health, climate anxiety, issues relating to poor self-esteem through the use of social media, etc., etc. Art education is positioned within what Alison Kafer has described as a curative future. And we should be wary when arts practice is reduced to the therapeutic and curative. And we know that historically, this has been experienced differently for disabled and non-disabled people. And I would ask there, does this legacy influence our understanding of quality? In the cases just discussed, disability is absent at curricular level, reflecting an underlying ableist assumption that disability is not a subject of or for learning. This has to be the starting point for me, as this seemingly intractable relationship between disability and art education can establish a problematic foundation for learners and teachers and societal expectations more broadly. And I'd ask a further question here. Does the inclusion of disability as a topic or subject within arts practice influence perceptions of quality? So this is the second part that I want to move on to, having sort of posed some of those questions. I'm going to focus particularly on assessment and assessment at A-level and GCSE. So I'm going to turn to some specific examples of quality judgments via assessment in art education in order to explore the potential for ableist assumptions. In an article about assessment in arts courses in higher education, art educator Mark Graham advises, assessment in art is notoriously difficult and is probably best approached with skepticism. After all, the aim is to encourage the not yet imagined. It requires nuanced subjective judgment and good judges. And I think that relates really well to what Mike was talking about in terms of this idea about the freedom to encourage people to think about this not yet imagined, this openness to uncertainty that a number of people have explored who write about art education. This highlights underlying tensions for a subject that promotes individual creative expression whilst needing to operate within standardized regulatory frameworks. And again, I'll just allude to anecdotally talking about my own experience as an art educator. I started teaching art when the national curriculum was only just introduced. So we had a year or two before the assessment regime was introduced for art. And when this was the introduction of the ideas of levels of study. So students' work was levelled. And at the time, it seemed completely incomprehensible as an art teacher that you would have that sort of framework for art education. So I'm going to ask now, how do our assessment processes take account of disability? And argue that they do that in a range of ways. So the current assessment guidance for GCSE and A-level in England must take account of access. And the following guidance is included by the AQA. So this is one of the assessment boards or the examination boards, is the AQA. And it says here, the subject criteria have been assessed to see if any of the skills or knowledge required present any possible difficulty to any students, whatever their ethnic background, religion, sex, age, disability, or sexuality. If any difficulties were encountered, the criteria were reviewed again to make sure that tests of specific competencies were only included if they were important to the subject. And again, just thinking about the language there, the language of assessment comes through here when we start to talk about specific competencies. There feel some real tensions there between this openness to the not yet imagined. So we talk about art as enabling the not yet imagined, but we talk about assessment which needs to take account of specific competencies. And I'm not saying that those can't coexist, I'm just highlighting that there are some tensions there. And in relation to disabled students, the guidance says, we can make arrangements for disabled students and disabled students and students with special needs to help them access the assessments, as long as the competencies being tested are not changed. So here there's an underlying concern with specific competencies relating to subject integrity. The limits of reasonable adjustments are therefore defined by the need to retain the idea of subject integrity. And I must apologise to Amanda because I feel like I've posed more questions than you asked us to answer. But my question here is, what are the limits to reasonable adjustments when assessing the quality of arts practice? And again, I would highlight whether there are tensions there when we're thinking about this idea of competencies. So in terms of quality judgments, these are the quality judgments that are signified within the assessment criteria. So here on the AQA and the GCSE and the A-level guidance defines quality of making in the following ways: the ability to handle materials, techniques and processes effectively, skillfully. It is important in enabling students to develop a personal language, to express ideas and to link their intentions to outcomes in a confident and assured manner. And within this, again, relating back to that idea about subjectivity over decision making in terms of quality, we then have to think about what's the nature of determining whether somebody has handled materials effectively. And we know that there's a whole range of cultural, social ideas that come into play when we think about that, as there are when we talk about ideas around skill and notions of skill. And there's been a lot written about the notions of skill. For example, in drawing, we might frame particular ideas about skill in school art education. And when people go on to develop their own practice in later years, we talk about this idea about unlearning those particular skills to try and work in different ways than those traditional skills-based approaches. So assessments of skill and effectiveness require degrees of subjectivity, hence the requirement for regulation via compulsory standardisation meetings for art teachers. And I think this is really important to note that actually within art teachers' practices, that some art educators are also incredibly conflicted about the ways that they want to interrogate assessment processes, the way they might want to interrogate assessment criteria. And they're also subject. So I would say that learners, teachers as well as learners, are subject to these processes regarding quality judgments. They themselves are subject to the quality judgments of Ofsted, for example, and all the regulatory frameworks we know that teachers have to work within. So they have to attend these compulsory standardisation meetings, and having attended a lot of those over the years, I know that there were often quite heated debates when there came to be certain judgments around quality and the assertion of particular grade boundaries for work. As Mark Graham noted then, assessment requires nuanced subjective judgment and good judges. But what makes a good judge? And, you know, again, that's another question that we can work with. Okay, I'm moving into the final stage of the talk now. And given the setup for this, which I should be used to having done a number of online events, but I always find it very difficult to engage without getting any feedback from an audience. So I'm hoping everybody's still there. It tells me there's 84 participants, so that's okay. So moving into what I've written here is logocentric quality judgments. And in my best Scouse, I would say what I mean is writing. So the ways that writing and particular literacy practices are used in determining notions of quality in art education. And although I've written elsewhere about ocular normativity, the dominance of vision in judgments around art education, I've also written about the ideas around technical ability and the ability to manipulate materials. Here, I want to just focus on the assessment criteria, on the emphasis that is given to writing. And it goes back to Mike's discussion here around the role of the sketchbook, and the sketchbook not only as relying on visual information, but also annotation. So here, writing and drawing are emphasised in linking intentions to outcomes. So here, pupils need to make the work, but they also need to be articulate in a number of ways of expressing the ways that those ideas have been realised from inception through to the final work. So writing and drawing are emphasised in linking intentions to outcomes. For example, drawing activity and written annotation must be evidenced in assessment objective 3. This was from the AQA A-level assessment objectives. And here it says we have to record ideas, observations and insights relevant to intentions as work progresses. At the highest level, this is described as an exceptional ability to skillfully and rigorously record ideas, observations and insights through drawing and annotation, and any other appropriate means relevant to intentions as work progresses. Whilst drawing may take a number of different forms, the annotation of work appears more prescriptive. So what I mean here is actually there may be a wide range of drawing processes and approaches that may be deemed to be acceptable. However, the annotation of work, the use of writing, appears prescriptive. In this scheme, a process is valued alongside product, and that was seen as being something that was beneficial in assessing the quality of artwork, is that students could show process, and this can be recorded in a wide range of ways. However, I think what's emerged over the years is this linearity of process, And this is implied alongside an emphasis on literacy skills that may create tensions in relation to the different ways people make and think about their work. The drive to show linearity of process, developmental stages of artwork through preparatory sketches, sketchbook development they value a particular approach to process. And this can result in what I've described elsewhere as a sketchbook aesthetic that fakes linearity as a normative practice. Annotation is implicated in explaining process, translating it into something more easily accessible. And I think this is a key point that I'd want to make, is that when we're thinking about quality judgments and then judgments around ability through assessment, these things have to take readily available forms. Work has to be easily accessible, and it has to sit within the formats that are available within our educational systems. Art as a school subject then is well placed to prioritise material ways of knowing and being, but appears in its highest level of assessment to prioritise literacy, since explaining and justifying process and intention must be made explicit through linguistic practices. Historically, the framing of art education as a vehicle for improving literacy has been embraced by art educators, amongst others, as a means of maintaining the status of the subject. Yet it may also contribute to the disappearance of art from art education. And I'm going back to Gert Biester's argument there. So moving into the final two slides here, I want to just talk a little bit about anti-ableist frameworks for assessment and the work that we've done in the anti-ableist pedagogy group, which aims to try and resist and contest ableism in art education, and to try and offer alternative ways of thinking through art education, where disability becomes a central part for those emerging ways of teaching and learning. One of the things that's been the most sticky things to address there, though, is assessment, where we always come back, though, how is quality assessed? How is the work assessed? So the presence of disability can enable alternative ways of thinking about assessment. In his book, Cultural Inclusion for Young People with SEND, Paul Morrow explains ipsative assessment. This is a process that involves individual, qualitative, narrative descriptions of learning. This is appealing as a means of assessment that moves beyond normative assessment criteria. But I'd say it's unlikely to challenge mainstream assessment practices, which rely on quantitative measures that seem essential for comparisons between pupils and the performance of their schools. So here, Paul is able to express some really innovative practice, but he is working within what would be described as a segregated or specialist school. And I would question whether those flexible approaches are as available within mainstream schools. So in my postscript, school assessment processes are only one factor that may influence the ways people come to value their own work, but we internalise these judgments. These impose external indicators of quality, which are not objective or neutral, but part of our political, social, and cultural contexts, and these are subject to change. It's vital, therefore, to continue to question the basis of our judgments regarding ability and quality, and to be open to alternatives.
Thanks so much, Claire. That was a really interesting presentation. I think you really kind of hit the nail on the head with so many of the tensions that exist within how art is taught, how it's received, and there are no easy answers. And I think that the kind of, you know, where quality meets quantity and quantity meets quality, those kind of factors sort of they undermine the real, the real learning that happens, I think, so often. And I think you summarized that with lots of very interesting ideas and questions. We've not got a lot of time for a lot of questions, but I'm really interested in your experience of the impact that these kind of generic assessment processes have on a person at graduate level who's getting ready to work in the real world. In your opinion, how does it affect them?
That's a massive question, and also, I think throws up the idea of the idea of the real world. I think one of the issues that is raised, I think, with the move from compulsory art education sometimes into degree level courses, people think about needing to shift practice as they're moving into that real world of higher education. It's well documented, this idea that people are encouraged to leave certain practices behind. However, then we know that within university level education, there's those constraints. People working at a particular level, needing to show particular competences in particular way. And I mean, anecdotally, people go into work as practicing artists, and we've got Christopher Samuels is talking later on today. Then I think that people would question the extent to which possibly them not being disenfranchised when going into the real world, but as with Mike, being liberated by a concept of being released into their own arts practice where they haven't got those constraints. But I know Amanda has also raised important issues in terms of, there are then still gatekeepers. So in terms of processes like gaining funding for putting on exhibitions or for being parts of projects, some of those things are still very reliant on needing to communicate in sort of normative ways of being able to process things. So I think there, and again, I've noticed that we've got Sonia Bouet in the audience here as well, and in the issue of AD, she's also talked about how those things impact. I think one of the biggest points that I would make in terms of one of the biggest tensions for art educators is that people who engage in art education have come through those systems and really want to support people to develop their own arts practice. And they know that they're often fighting the corner for the arts within school, which is an incredibly hostile environment. I'm not answering your question at all, but I think what art educators are often doing and really invested in is absolutely doing the best for their learners within the constraints of those systems. And I think, if anything, I would just urge people to just reflect on the role of the art educators and certainly look at work by disabled artist teachers for the ways that they've navigated, because I think there are some real models there for people not showing how they've so-called overcome disability in order to flourish, but the ways that has really informed their practice. And again, I talked about Sonia's work, but also some people who are working in the International Disability Studies in Art Education Network, where they're investigating these ideas. So yeah, I think self-esteem has to be absolutely key in people feeling enabled to engage in their practice. And fundamentally, anything that undermines a human's belief that they can shape and change the material world in creative ways is damaging. Anyway, probably stop there.
Well, yes, that's a very powerful statement to end on. We thank you so much, Claire. We need to go into a break, but I'll read out a couple of the comments first. Claire, you are fantastic, and I would like to read any publications and come to many more of your events, please. where can we follow you? Amanda's put in the chat that your Twitter is Penketc, Penketc. So is that the best place to follow you?
It is, although I'm hopeless at Twitter. I get a bit, it's a bit overwhelming, but yeah, I can, I mean, if anybody wants, my email will be available. So if anybody wants to email me about any questions about anything, I can send anything through, or maybe after the event, we can put information up there.
Thanks. And another comment here, it's such a good point about writing as part of assessments in art education, as well as once artists leave education. So many artists find it incredibly hard to articulate their practice in writing. That's why they're working in a visual medium. But if they find it hard to write about their work, this can be a huge career barrier. I think that's very true. It's it sort of plays into lots of the questions that you raised there about how we judge quality. Lastly, Pippa Marshall says, I'm really interested in the implications of the word exceptional in assessment, as it sounds unnecessarily competitive. Potentially everyone could produce high quality work, but presumably not everyone can be exceptional. I'm also interested in how this might interact with ideas around disability. Do you have any further thoughts?
Well, exceptionality is an interesting one, and yes, it is. I mean, it does suggest competition, and we know when we're engaging in qualifications that those things are monitored. So if there are, you know, if we judge everybody to be exceptional, then you know, the argument is that it undermines those structures, and people start to get a slap on the wrist for giving too many firsts, giving too many A's, and the system is then moderated to show that. And I think, you know, again, that you know, there is an argument here that this doesn't sit well with a subject like art and art in education, as being part of those systems, has to try and negotiate and navigate a tricky place in terms of defining, you know, because we have to say, if somebody's described as exceptional, we're then by implication describing other people as non-exceptional, or as, you know, so that there's that scale, and within that scale, what, you know, what does that mean? So yeah, exceptionalities are, we could have a long time talking about that. So thanks for Pippa for bringing that out.
It's breaking down those hierarchies, isn't it? That's why these kinds of conversations are so important, that we challenge those hierarchical values.
And I think where we're not able to, because of those some things that are so ingrained, and you know, not to be too defeatist, but one of the things around art education, art educators and people engaging in arts practice, is that they find the you know, the water flows through the cracks, if you like. There's, you know, there's always a way for those practices to be happening, despite and around of, and sometimes in direct tension with some of those things that are happening. I mean, actually, we've just got a special issue of the journal coming out, which was around the theme of belonging, and part of that is around, you know, art education as culturally responsive, critical social practice. So there are people who are really invested in that, and sometimes, as with the special education discourse, people choose alternative ways to start framing the debates. So we're constrained by those assessment criteria and processes, but it's what else is there? How else can people flourish in different ways?
Subversion, that's the word that comes to mind. Thank you so much, Claire. On that note, we have gone over time, and we do need to go into a bit of a break. Thank you so much. That was brilliant, and thank you to everyone who's stayed the course with us. And we'll take a break now until 12:30. We might actually go over a little bit more than that. So I would suggest we break until 12:35, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break.
Great, thank you.
Great. Bye, we're seeing at 12:35. Welcome back, everyone. So now we have our In Conversation segment for the day. So please welcome Gustavo Grandal Montero, an art librarian and researcher. So he joined the Tate as a library collections and engagement manager in 2021 and was previously a subject librarian and special collections curator at the University of Arts, London. We then have Adrian Glue, a qualified as an archivist and art historian, manages the National Archive of British Art, which houses over 20 million pieces and which currently comprises a team of 7 based at Tate Britain. Adrian and his team were closely involved in the planning and production of a major digitisation project, Archives and Access, funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, which in 2013 enabled 52,000 items and pieces to be digitised and made available alongside artworks on Tate's website for the very first time. Please welcome Alice Insey, as she is a curator for Tate, specialising in British art of the long 18th century. In this role, she has worked on several exhibitions and displays, including curating the Georgian galleries in Tate Britain's permanent collection in May 2023. She's co-curating the Hogarth and the Europe exhibition 2021-22 and assisting in the Aubrey Beardsley exhibition 2020. Prior to joining Tate, she worked closely with the Derby Museum and Art Gallery whilst undertaking her PhD at the University of Nottingham, which explored the legacy and reception of the painter Joshua Wright of Derby. So please welcome Martin Myron, who will be moderating this conversation. Martin is the head of grants and fellowships and networks of the Paul Mellon Centre, as in conveyor of the British Art Network. Before joining the Paul Mellon Centre, he held a series of curatorial roles at Tate Britain, focusing on the British art. So over to you, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Yes, I'm Martin Myron. I'm a middle-aged man wearing a cardigan, perhaps predictably, middle-aged white man with slightly wonky, broken reading glasses, and I'm sitting in my office at the Paul Mellon Centre in front of a window which faces the sun, so I have to have it shuttered. So there's a shuttered window behind me. Hopefully I'm not too badly silhouetted. It's my pleasure to moderate this middle section of the day, focusing on Tate's collections, its archives, library, and historic art collections with our 3 Tate colleagues here. As Amanda mentioned, I am a former Tate person. I spent 22 years at the Tate working in various curatorial roles. So I sort of know Tate from both sides, inside and outside. So I'm going to be very interested to hear these further thoughts. A note on timings. We were due to run till 1:15, which is the lunch break. We may run over a little bit. We'll try not to go too far because people want their lunches, which is fair enough. And we'll hear from Gustavo, Adrian, and Alice in turn with their presentations before going into a Q&A session and some conversation, which will take us to about 1:15 or so. The 3 panelists have been provided prompts or points of discussion, which I'll share with you now before handing over to the first of our speakers. These talking points were: have you seen a change in how disability/chronic illness is presented within archives, libraries, and curatorial work, specifically at the Tate? What are the benefits of having diverse material covering disability, chronically ill people within archives and libraries? What are the curatorial questions around representing disability, chronic illness among historic artists and archives? How are these being addressed? And finally, a question about how living artists approach libraries, archives, curatorial work on the representation of their work for future preservation. So quite a range of topics there, but I think each of you have been able to interpret and respond to those thoughts with your presentations. So with that, we're going to take it in order: Gustavo first, and then Adrian, and then Alice. So Gustavo, over to you.
Thank you, Martin, and Thank you, Amanda. Hopefully you can hear me and you can see the slide on the screen. Yes, my name is Gustavo Grandal Montero. I'm a Library Collections and Engagement Manager at Tate. I'm a white middle-aged man, originally from Galicia, speaking to you from an office at Tate Britain. For those of you not familiar with Tate Library, we are a center of excellence for art historical research, with holdings including about 500,000 publications on British art from 1500 and international art since 1900, including books, journals, and online resources about art and artists, exhibition catalogs, artist books, photo books, scenes by artists from the 1960s to the present, really. And these collections are developed and managed by a team of 9 librarians, with 2 liaison librarians with responsibility for British art and another 2 colleagues responsible for international art. The library of the Tate acquires new material both by donation and by purchase, but only major acquisitions, for instance, a name major special collection, like for instance, the Martin Parr collection of photo books that we acquired a few years ago, being part of the Tate formal acquisitions process. The image that you see on the screen is the Library and Archive reading rooms at Tate Britain. That is free to use space, open to all. Disability is an important area that is included in the library acquisitions strategy. The library collects published materials on visibility and representation of disability in art and comprehensively on disabled artists, both related to British art and international art. We have also been in collaboration with the Disability Network at Tate to develop the range of library resources available to Tate staff to enhance their understanding of disability and access, and to support colleagues and visitors with disabilities, and to increase awareness and representation of disability in art. And you have a couple of images on the screen, one of a visit of the Disability Network colleagues to Tate Library last year, and another one of a range of publications that we have acquired recently, and we have been promoting to Tate colleagues in collaboration with the Disability Network. We are currently working on a new online guide on resources about disability and art, being created in collaboration with the Disability Network to, again, increase representation of disability and awareness and knowledge of disabled artists. And finally, maybe say in terms of the library team and our priorities in annual plans, the disability and EDI are included in our annual plans as a priority area for acquisition, and is also considered in cataloging and access provision. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. Finally, this is a subject area that is included in our program of displays, exhibitions and events curated by Library and Archive staff. Events like show and shares will actively include this area. For instance, recently we included material on disability from the Panchayat collection, and we followed Tate guidance from interpretation team on how to present and discuss the work of the disabled artists in these public presentations. There are very large volumes of published material, or relatively large volumes of published material on this general area. From academic books on disability, and on the image on the screen, you have got the covers of 3 recent publications, to self-published scenes, and even ephemera related to the practice of artists that are disabled or that engage in work that engages with this topic. This presents both challenges and advantages to the library team. The volume can be challenging, particularly in terms of cataloging. We are not able to always create very extensive catalog records in the way that, for instance, an artwork is described on the Tate website. But it also, as I say, presents advantages in that we have a much wider collecting remit than our colleagues in the curatorial team, for instance, when they look at artworks, can possibly have, and we don't need to be as selective. So the issues of judgment on quality, for instance, are much less relevant to library acquisitions that potentially are in other areas. All library materials are catalogued and can be searched on our online library catalog, and we base our descriptions of publications and other materials in the library collection on international standards for library cataloging, like RDA. So we will include information about the title, and we will rely to some extent on the way that the authors and the publishers present the work. So particularly in commercially published material, it will be a standard practice to have a blurb on the content of the book that has been put together either by the publisher or the editor or the artist, or a combination of all of those. You often have got some biographical information on those involved in the creation, and that may provide content that is related to the discussion that we're having today. And if that is the case, we will include that in our catalog records. There are a number of subject headings that we will include in the record. Like, for instance, we use a number of control vocabularies or lists of topics that we apply to describe our materials. For instance, Library of Congress subject heading. This is another library international standard on indexing of library collections, and this will include subject terms like artists with disabilities that we will assign to those publications that are relevant when we have that information. People with disabilities in art in terms of the content, and a more general that is disabilities that we will use on more general applications. We also collect publications by artists. So these are not publications about art. These are publications that are part of the practice of an artist that use self-publishing or that collaborates with commercial publishers to create work using the medium of the book or the zine or the magazine or the card or other forms of printed matter. There are some ethical considerations when cataloging this material, particularly when something has been self-published in a small scale and not necessarily intended or possibly even envisaged by the artist as ending up being part of the permanent collection of a major international museum like the Tate. To give you a couple of examples, here on the screen, you have got images of the covers of 2 publications by artists. The first one is seen by an artist called Electra KB, based in New York. This is a scene called My Altered Body, published in Brooklyn, New York, in an edition of 100 copies. And There's also the cover of an artist publication by an artist called Yvonne Short, also based in New York, published in Queens in collaboration with the publisher Industrial Gingerbread in 2020 in an edition of 50 copies. As I say, this material is not necessarily envisaged by the artist as ended up in a major institution and listed in a catalog that is available to anyone from anywhere with an internet connection. So we try to contact the artists when we acquire this work. Sometimes we acquire this directly from the artist, and in this case, we will be very clear that we will make this item available to general researchers and public, and can be used in exhibitions. In other cases, we may buy in fairs through specialist dealers and in other forums. And if that is the case, we will try to contact the artist when possible to let them know that we are doing this, and also to ask for advice on the way that we catalog these items. Sometimes we find information on the website of the artist or the publisher or the social media, but when possible, we try to contact the artist directly. And this is one of the many joys of working with contemporary artists, that sometimes it's possible to have a discussion directly with them and discuss, for instance, how they want to present disability or considerations about disability in connection with their work and themselves as individuals and artists. And again, perhaps issues of quality are less of a consideration, or I would say they're not necessarily a consideration for us. We are much more, certainly not an explicit consideration. We aim to collect a wide range of practices, and both in terms of themes and artists, but also in terms of backgrounds, materials, and as I say, we are perhaps from that point of view less selective than other parts of the museum. In addition to acquiring new published material related to disability and art, we welcome artists contacting us directly about their self-published work, and we acquire this type of material, and this information is on our website. And this is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So we'll move straight on to Adrian and hear about archives at Tate.
Thanks, Martin. Just find my PowerPoint. Hello, my name is Adrian Glue. I'm a white male with Anglo-Scottish heritage, so I was born with blue eyes, ginger hair and freckles. I still have the blue eyes and freckles, though my hair is now much more salt and pepper. I'm speaking from in front of a screen from home, and I'm wearing a dark blue shirt. This slide is titled Tate Archive, depicting rows of archive boxes housed on rolling stacks in our stores at Tate Britain. As the date of this seminar, my name and my email address, adrian.glue@tate.org.uk. So I'm the archivist for Tate Archive, where I manage a team of 6 to acquire, catalogue and disseminate information about art archives relating to British fine art practice. We now house and care for more than 1,000 archive collections containing over 20 million pieces. Like the library's holdings, these archives are made publicly available online and to the public in purpose-built research facilities called the Hyman Criman Reading Rooms at Tate Britain. This slide is titled What is in Tate Archive, and on the right-hand side repeats the image of one of our rolling stacks, with on the left-hand side bullet points that I will now run through. So Tate Archive is a collecting archive or a specialist repository that actively acquires material from outside Tate rather than the gallery's own records, which is managed by a separate team of public records colleagues. Tate Archive's prime function is to acquire archive collections relating to British fine art practice created by, among others, artists, particularly those represented in Tate's collection, art writers, curators, art historians, art administrators and gallerists, as well as arts organisations such as commercial galleries, funding bodies, exhibiting bodies and societies. Additionally, we collect international archival material from artists and art world figures active in the UK when relating to Tate works, and for our artificial collections of audiovisual material, photographs, posters and single items. This slide is titled Types of Material in Tate Archive, and on the right-hand side depicts two colourful sketch scrapbooks of landscape scenes by John Piper, with on the left a set of bullet points that I'll now also run through. As noted previously, Tate Archive currently contains over 20 million pieces or pages, so it's the world's largest repository for British fine art practice, with all manner of items collected such as personal papers like birth, marriage and death certificates, passports, identity cards and so on. Correspondence, which helps to place the person or institution within a certain art network, friendships or business contacts. Diaries and writings, which can provide a wealth of unpublished information to our researchers. Sketchbooks like the one on this slide by Piper. Sculptors' maquettes, such as Niam Gabo's early plastic models. Financial records like check stubs, invoices, receipts, and so on. Documentary photographs within albums or loose prints and negatives. Audiovisual material such as oral interviews, films and videos. And increasingly born digital material such as Microsoft and Mac software, email accounts, floppy disks and so on. We also have artist materials like samples of brushes and palettes, and even artist libraries, especially those that transcend the collecting policy of Tate Library. So all in all, trying to document an artist's oeuvre and life, and also the art institution's history. This slide is titled Disabled Artists in Our Collections and depicts on the right-hand side a rainbow-coloured flyer headed Outsiders, and on the left-hand side some of our key collections, which include the Musgrave Kinley Outsider Art Archive. This is a 50-box collection containing the genesis, acquisition and display of the largest such collection in the UK, which was donated by the Outsider Art Trustees to the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, with the archive similarly donated to Tate in 2003. The archive collection contains information about more than 100 artists from around the world. The second one on this list is Bernard Meninsky's archives, and in particular, his heavily annotated books within his own library, which bear witness to the immense psychological struggles that sadly led to his suicide in 1950. Ian Breakwell's archives shine a light on how these struggles were managed in the 1970s, when Breakwell became an artist placement at the Department of Health and Social Security as a unique experiment to embed an artist within a psychiatric hospital setting. The records of the Institute of Contemporary Art, also known as the ICA, on the other hand, document that institution's exhibitions, talks, theatre and cinematic emanations, such as the exhibition of schizophrenic art in 1955 and a proposal for performance by the Royal National Institute for the Deaf Mime Group in 1969. Finally, we house the archive of Donald Rodney, a Black British artist who suffered from sickle cell anemia. His notes, sketchbooks, which he took with him to hospital, are probably our most exhibited artifacts. They are extraordinary sketchbooks and constitute a protean creative mind. And I'm pleased to say they've all been digitized and are available on Tate's website. Details at the end of this presentation. This slide is titled Disabled Artists in Our Collection, Recent Accessions, and depicts a self-portrait of artist Dorothy Brett in the lower right-hand of the image, whilst on the left-hand side, bullet points list some of our recent accessions, including some unique sketches and drawings by Brett, as one of the pioneering female artists who went to the Slade School of Art in the early part of the 20th century. She and fellow artists such as Dora Carrington radically cut off their long hair and became known as the Cropheads by fellow students. Not long after graduating and emigrating to the USA, Brett became profoundly deaf, so very little of her oeuvre remains in the UK, which makes this material, which was acquired very recently, and all of which has been digitized, all the more special. The other key collection recently acquired after a fundraising campaign by the Art Fund is an archive collection from Derek Jarman's Prospect Cottage in Dungeness. This includes a remarkable series of chronological photograph albums, his CD collection, and fascinating scrapbooks relating to his films, including Blue, that Jarman completed as he became blind as a complication from acquiring AIDS. Anglo-Pakistani sculptor and installation artist Hamad Butt also suffered disabilities due to the AIDS virus and sadly died very young. In 2019, his brother gave his papers to Tate and they have recently been catalogued. The final artist on this list, Pauline Smith, suffered from ME throughout her life, which made it difficult to create, curate, and attend her own exhibitions. This is perhaps one reason why much of her work was sent through the post, as one of Britain's leading correspondence artists. And correspondence art is one of the key collections that we house in Tate Archives. This slide is entitled Disabled Artists in Our Collections, Auditing and Action, with a pie chart on the right of the slide and a series of 3 bullet points that I'll now expand upon. So in 2020, we commissioned an audit of our collections to get a greater sense of the percentage of diverse heritage artists that make up our 1,000 collections. As this was begun during the pandemic, when we did not have physical access to our collections, this was very much an online sweep. The methodology of the audit encompassed 4 areas of identity that we felt were being marginally represented in our holdings, such as female artists, LGBTQ plus artists, Black British artists, Jewish emigre artists, and disabled artists, with the percentage figure for this group turning out to be 7%, represented by the pie chart on the right-hand side of the slide. One of the aims of the survey was to locate marginalized, so-called marginalized materials in apparently dominant collections. However, due to time factors, it was not possible to conduct a deeper survey of our larger uncatalogued collections, but the aim is to make a deeper dive to surface other marginal materials in the coming year. This work has also fed into a revised archive acquisition strategy that is currently being drafted, which will see ways to mitigate any negative results so that our collection can more accurately reflect society and those working in the arts, bearing in mind that most archive collections are offered to us late in the life of an artist, or when an institution closes, resulting in certain amounts of time lags in collecting collections. We do, however, have artificial or in-house collections of photographs, unpublished audiovisual records, artist design posters, and single items to capture more contemporary voices. And in the library, there is also an extensive press cutting collection. Over and above the strategy, diversity and inclusion is, of course, at the forefront of our team and individual plans. This slide is titled How Tate Archive is Used and depicts on the right one of our archive explorers or guides talking to visitors about a display in the Marie-Louise von Motoczewski Archive Gallery at Tate Britain, with 4 of the 10 wall cases in view. On the left is a series of bullet points that I'll now go through. So Tate Archive material is used primarily for research via our online resources, and as you've heard in the Hyman Crichton reading rooms, but also for display purposes at Tate. Our external users include, amongst others, academic researchers, provenance researchers, picture researchers, broadcasters, artists and their families, students, and the general public. In addition, archival material is lent elsewhere, with items from Tate Archive often representing 10 to 15% of loans from Tate in any given year. Finally, this slide is entitled How to Use Tate Archive and depicts on the right-hand side a view of one of our reading rooms at Tate Britain. with some details on the left-hand side about how to access us, which I'll now run through. As noted previously, Tate Archive is housed in the Hyman Criman Reading Rooms at Tate Britain, which is along the corridor from the main cloakroom. And the reading rooms are open Monday to Thursdays from 11 till 5 o'clock. Anyone can register and make an appointment to consult our material by emailing our colleagues at reading.rooms@tate.org.uk. And visitors can order up to 15 items per visit when emailing and make further requests when on site. As Gustavo mentioned, our reading rooms are open to all, and we very much look forward to seeing many of you join us in the near future. Information about our collections can be found on our online catalogue with the link here, and more than 75,000 digitised icons can now be found on the additional link, which is on the screen. Thank you very much, and I'll now hand over to my curatorial colleague, Alice Inslee, Curator of British Art, 1730 to 1850.
Hi, I'm Alice. I'm a white woman with kind of longish, slightly messy brown hair, and I'm in a black jumper and a grey top. Before I get going, I just thought I'd check in about timing, because I know that we're a bit tight and everyone wants lunch.
I think we've agreed, Amanda suggested we might run on a little bit beyond 15:15. We certainly want to be finished by well before past if we can. So maybe if you can do sort of 5 to 10 minutes, and that will segue into questions. I've got a couple of things in the chat which I'll feed through to you.
Yeah, great. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. So I thought I just wanted to kind of let me just check. I'm not sure how my slides are coming up, so I hope they're kind of in presenter mode. Anyway, if you can see the others, then never mind.
Yeah, we can see the main slide. Okay, I think it's
great. So I guess I just wanted to start by saying that I am, I guess, coming from a very particular perspective of working with the historic collection at Tate Britain, and that my research is really in its early stages. So please do bear with me. And that's also why I was really keen to join today, because I think this is a really wonderful opportunity to learn and kind of get ideas. I thought I'd start off though by talking about this painting, which is by William Parry, of his father, John Parry, who was a Welsh harpist. And this was the work that one of the first acquisitions I worked on when I joined Tate. And it's kind of the artwork, I guess, that got me interested in researching the history of disability in Tate's 18th century collection. The painting shows John Parry. It's a 3/4 portrait. He's wearing a blue suit with a white wig, and he's framed by a painted oval. And his hands are resting on top of a Welsh harp, which is identifiable by its 3 rows of strings, and his eyes are closed. And his closed eyes is quite a conventional way of indicating that a sitter is blind in the 18th century. John Parry was celebrated as the famous blind harper in his lifetime, and he was a key figure in the Celtic revival. And I think what caught my attention about this painting was the fact that John Parry is shown absorbed in his own thoughts, and his hands are resting on the harp rather than actively playing. And the way that the light falls from the top left means that his forehead and his hands are highlighted to really kind of emphasize that fact. And I think this is perhaps a way of alluding to how he perceived the world through touch, sound, and cognition. And that really got me thinking more broadly about how blindness and disability are represented in 18th century art, how this might reflect or intersect with attitudes of the time, and what it meant for artists to experience disability in the 18th century. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I am at the very early stages of exploring this. So I've been working to develop a research plan, and I hope to start researching artists in Tate's collection to gain a better understanding of which artists lived with disability or chronic illness. It's a slightly daunting task, as there are 417 artists represented in the collection who were born between 1700 to 1799 alone. So my plan is to do a kind of initial scoping exercise using resources like the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography to get a sense of the bigger picture, and then deepening this research through archival material like exhibition reviews and contemporary accounts. And I hope that this research will feed into how we interpret and present the collection, and also perhaps inform our acquisition strategy too. And it's also an opportunity to consult and collaborate more widely around how we might tell some of these stories. I think what's kind of interesting quite early on is, even at this point, is how exploring the lived experience of artists can help tell a much richer and more human story. So Joshua Reynolds, for example, is arguably one of the most famous British artists of the 18th century. And the story that tends to get privileged about him is his role in defining and raising the status of a British school of painting, notably as the first president of the Royal Academy. What is perhaps less talked about, but was widely known at the time and is still widely known now, is his disability. Reynolds was partially deaf from the 1750s when he caught a cold in Italy, and then his eyesight also deteriorated in later life, and he had an inflammation of the eye in 1783, and in 1789 he had to cancel one of his kind of portrait appointments because, in his words, his left eye was beginning to be obscured. And he quite quickly was almost completely blind by 1791. And I think this story emerges in several images. So firstly, here we have Johann Zoffany's painting of the foremost royal academicians exhibited in 1772. And it shows a group of men gathered around a nude model in an interior intended to suggest a life drawing class. And Reynolds stands near the center of the gathering. He's dressed all in black, and he's holding a silver ear trumpet that he used to help with his hearing. So in a very kind of public setting, his deafness is highlighted. Reynolds also painted self-portraits throughout his career, including these two, which I think speak to his hearing and his eyesight. So on the right, Reynolds shows himself in a dark suit against a dark background, looking out at the viewer, and his left hand is cupped around his left ear. And this was intended for a friend, so a more private setting, but he was clearly open about his partial deafness. And then on the left, again, he's in a dark grey suit against a plain dark background, looking directly out at the viewer, and he's wearing spectacles. And this is quite a rare painting in which he refers to his deteriorating eyesight, although the painting itself was widely copied. And I think what's interesting about this, or what I hope this suggests, is how bringing these overlooked stories to light can provide an opportunity to tell new stories about artists and artworks, even when they're as familiar and famous as Reynolds. And I also hope it demonstrates how exploring histories of disability in the 18th century can make our galleries more interesting, more relevant and more welcoming to visitors, and more representative of people's range of lived experiences, both today and in the past. And at Tate, we're already trying to ensure that we're telling a more diverse and inclusive story of British art, both in our recent rehang of the permanent collections at Tate Britain, and there's a real drive to use our collection more, but also as a kind of principle that shapes our acquisition strategy. And we're trying to bring works into Tate that will expand the canon. And we're particularly focusing on increasing and strengthening the representation of women artists, LGBTQIA+ artists, artists of colour, and artists with disability and neurodiversity. And there's still a lot more to do, but I thought I'd kind of wrap up by sharing some of the kind of questions that I've been mulling over and that I don't have all the answers for. So I'd be really interested and keen to hear people's thoughts and ideas. But the first one is around, is it ethical to identify artists as disabled retrospectively? And on what terms might we do that? How do we centre lived experience within this research? How can we research and define disability in a way that recognises and addresses historically shifting social perspectives and attitudes towards disability? How do we acknowledge the gaps or silences in the archival record and work against the grain to bring new stories to light? And lastly, kind of further down the line, how might we share these stories in the most accessible and inclusive way, both in the gallery and online? I think I will wrap up there.
Well, thank you very much, Alice, and to Gustavo and Adrian for those kind of very informative but also kind of reflective presentations about Tate, such a a prominent organisation and such a prominent collection. I was struck, amongst other things, about 20 million pieces in the archive collections. I mean, it's a reminder of the scale of this operation, of these collections. We've got a few minutes, and I know we're running into lunchtime, but I think we've agreed in the team that we can take a few minutes for conversation within the team. And I'd like to pick up this a very interesting chat. I think the chat's going to be captured. There's a very interesting chat and going in several different directions at the moment, but picking up on really kind of questions of classification. So I'd like to go back to something, Gustavo, that you said right at the beginning, and it's not as if you to answer, but it is, you made the point that Tate is a kind of centre of excellence. It's the sort of thing that organisations tend to put in their taglines. They're, major, they're the outstanding, they're the world class, they're the centre of excellence. And I wonder, do you feel as curators, librarians, archivists, that claim to excellence is enabling, or is it itself a limitation? Does it kind of create limitations or a burden in terms of your work? And what sort of exclusions might be involved there as well? Is it something that you've thought about?
Yes, it's a good question. I was referring specifically to the library collection, and I was using the term primarily from the point of view of scope and the service that it provides as a collection. As I say, we possibly are quite different from other Tate collections in that we avoid making judgments about quality to a very large extent. We try to have a comprehensive and wide-ranging approach to how we collect material on both British art and international art. So it is a general reflection on the scope, really, of the collection, as opposed to a claim related to its quality as such. We certainly hope to be a leading institution from the point of view of our professional standards. And we do think, for instance, we have been critically reflecting on how we catalog and what language we use to describe disability in connection with our collections, publications in Tate Library.
Adrian, Alice, do you have any thoughts on this? Because it's one of the themes of today about how judgments of quality and particularly in a kind of a big and prominent and public organisation like Tate. I mean, there are questions about what those judgments of quality actually entail.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've been trying to grapple with, I guess, is how many kind of assumptions of quality are made but are perhaps not explicit. And this is something that we've thought about in relation to the acquisition strategy, for example. One of the things that has sometimes been kind of looked at, for example, is, and again, talking in terms of the historic collection, things like exhibition history or publication record, which of course privileges certain institutions and excludes a whole host of practicing artists. So I think trying to really be mindful of those kind of assumptions that we might be making, and trying to unpick them in the way that we move forward. I'm not sure that really answers the question.
No, that's. I'm actually kind of leads to I think what might have to be a kind of wind up question or final question. Again, it kind of reflects some of the discussion in the chat as well, which I think will be captured and shared with you, so you can see that. Which is to think about, you know, your own training and your own backgrounds, and what support and what training our staff within Tate getting when it comes to addressing questions about disability and representation within the collection and beyond. And it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more if there is training or support or guidance that you're offered in thinking about these issues.
Yeah, we have a very active Tate Learn department that offers online training and also in-person training. And I recently went on a training with regards to neurodiversity. So there is quite a lot on offer, but I think we all need and should expect more training in this area, because I think it's a vital area for all our collections. And although Alice was mentioning that obviously the art collection are moving away from exhibition histories in terms of what they acquire, we have a little bit more leeway in what we can acquire, but perhaps not as much leeway as Gustavo. So we are constrained to some extent by Tate's collecting remits, if one can call it that.
And Alice, anything to add in terms of the curatorial and thinking about historic collections and the discussions that might be happening around classification and the languages that you use? I imagine there's involvement with the interpretation team and learning team.
Yeah, so there's always, there is the training that Adrian mentioned, but there's always the interpretation team and the research team who would also work closely with us in terms of interpretation within the gallery and online. And there's also, I think, one of the things that we're increasingly thinking about is consultation and collaboration as well. And I've certainly been looking at projects like, for example, the Everywhere and Nowhere project that the National Trust have collaborated with Leicester University on, for example, as kind of ways of thinking about how we might work going forward, and as kind of kind of examples of best practice and things.
Okay, all right. Well, I think just with an eye on time and knowing that we're now 10 minutes over schedule and going into our lunch break, we should probably wind things up there. And I know that there's further kind of questions and comments in the chat about classification and the remit of the collection. I think we'll be able to share, the team will be sharing some links to the Tate, and there are published documentation about acquisitions policy and the remit of the various collections, which you can point people to. Is that, I think that's right, but there's certainly material out there, because it's, you know, there's a lot to think about here, and I think you've been very generous in sort of thinking through your own areas of work and some of the questions arising out of that, and reflecting on some of the work which is being done within Tate presently. So thank you very much, and I think Amanda, I can see you there. Did you want to kind of hop in before we do break for our lunch break? So much rich material. I think we do need a pause.
Yes, definitely. Thank you to all of you, including yourself, Martin, for moderating that. And I just wanted to pick up on, I've been monitoring the chat and things, and there was a lot of comments about labelling. And I just wanted to add in, this was a big area that we did discuss between us all. And we just wanted to highlight that there is a lot of active change, such as Adrian's audit, the research Alice is doing, and also the types of material that is now going into the library. So please do take that as a positive. Change does not happen overnight. There is a lot to catch up with, and you know, I think this team especially are very active within that. So I wanted to leave on a positive note, and just say a massive thank you to all of you for your contributions, because it was really insightful, and there definitely is a lot to unpick there. So I just wanted to say I just dropped into the chat there a survey for anyone that needs to leave. This is also for the panelists as well to complete if you can. It's very short, it's only 5 questions, and it's just about your experience of how you found this presentation so far. So it's now 1:28, so we'll come back at 2:30 and we'll commence then. So thank you so much everyone for joining. Thank you so much to Alice, Martin, Gustavo and Adrian. It's been really great to have you, and thank you for Ali for interpretation, and we'll see you at 2:30. Welcome back everyone, and I hope you all had a good lunch break and had something to eat and everything, so, and a good rest. So we're joined now by Paula Orrell. So Paula is the lead Visual Arts Southwest and the director of CVAN in England, a national organisation where the visual arts meet policy change and partners with 9 regional networks to support, campaign and advocate for the visual arts sector. Paula is passionate about social, economic and environmental change within visual arts communities. Paula is dyslexic and a leading advocate in the sector, and is a co-chair of the Coventry Biennial. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you, Amanda. I've had a great morning so far, and I really enjoyed all of the presentations. I really appreciate Amanda and everyone behind the scenes for producing this seminar today. I'm just going to move this thing that's just swung. Hang on a minute. Some random cord at the back of me. I should self-describe. My name is Paula Orrell. I am a middle-aged white woman with brownish blonde hair, and I've got shelves in the background, and I'm wearing a brown roll neck with a black jacket, and my hair's to my shoulder length as well. So today when Amanda kind of approached me, I thought, God, this is quite interesting. This will be the first time I've actually spoken about my being dyslexic, because I don't see it as a disability. I actually see it as something that's part of my creative practice that I really kind of embed in the way that I think and the way that I see the world. And the reason I suppose I've started to really talk about this more widely in the sector is because I've only started to identify really as being dyslexic. And I think for many during the pandemic, and I do know many colleagues during the pandemic, they were really kind of thinking about their neurodivergence approach, or being diagnosed. I think for many colleagues, it was a period of time of quite obviously intense self-reflection in many different ways for many different people. So I'm a curator by trade. I studied fine arts, sculpture. I'm really interested in the making process and working with artists and really thinking in a creative curatorial approach. How I see work is that I think of images. Images come to my mind. So I work, I suppose, in a different way from traditional curators who think in a art kind of language or a visual language that describes the work. I see the work through the form, how it's made, the processes, and the images that kind of I bring those images together to make kind of a language, I suppose, in my own mind. I often laugh about my being dyslexic, because it's like one of those funny jokes, you know, the dyslexic curator. I can laugh at my own disability, to name it a disability in this context. And I do find it funny, because I suppose in a way that's why I've kind of been able to be a bit braver about discussing where I am and who I am, really, I suppose, and how I want to present myself in the world, I think is really important, and why I think that's important also for the visual arts sector. I experienced a lot of ableist approaches very early on in my career. One of the most disheartening kind of moments where a former director I worked with just stood in my office and said, "You're dyslexic," did nothing about it, and turned around and walked out. I mean, imagine a young curator standing there going, "God, I am so paranoid. This is a practice that is defined by writing, is about language, is about how to communicate and describe works of art by artists." And that was disabling. That was more disabling than being dyslexic, because I have ways of coping. I have ways of that I, you know, work around it, and the ways that I kind of adopted, very much so. I think probably adopted without the support that I now put in place, you know, led to, you know, absolute burnout at one point in my career. These ableist attitudes still continue. You know, I ask my colleagues to send me bullet points about thoughts, ideas, what they, you know, what they need. That still doesn't happen. I get essays that I have to navigate and work through and think through. I think this continuous ableism, you know, it for me, it's harming, because it's the way that people want to see you, and the way that people react to you, and the way that they won't change their attitudes and approaches, which is really disheartening. At our national programme for CVAN, Contemporary Visual Arts Network, we're developing a programme called Fair and Equitable that we've had a pilot year. And in that pilot year, a lot of kind of data and information came forward that's now enabled us to take the next phase of the programme through till 2026, which hopefully we will announce in about 6 months' time, and be able to support practitioners across the country, in England, that is, funded through Arts Council England programme. So more to come on that in the future. But what I wanted to, what I discussed with Amanda was thinking about this creative curating and how I approach working with artists, and how I relate images to artists' ideas, rather than the more formal kind of practices of exhibition making and in production. Mike, in his presentation, spoke about when artist work is put into a gallery space, it's being judged for the first time within this art history and this kind of canon of art. In a way, I find that one of the most disabling kind of issues that we have actually at times, and that you don't see in other art forms, that kind of is this kind of wide level of judgment. I'm going to present 2 slides now and talk about an exhibition idea that I have in relation to judgment and quality. I've always been really inspired by these 2 artists' work. So Nena Kalu and Phila de Barle. I'm presenting these 2 images of these artists' work because this for me is about thinking about an exhibition that relates to value systems in our so-called art world. Nena Kalu is an artist who works with Action Space in London. She's driven by an instinctive and determined urge to build and make repeated marks and forms through kind of circles. Circles are her kind of go-to form that is repetitive. And she works intensely on these works through 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional sculptures and installations and drawings. Phila de Barle sadly passed away. For 60 years, she created installations using materials, cardboard, fabric, plaster and cement, making large-scale sculptures and imposing installations from materials that she found around herself. What I find really interesting about these 2 artists is that one is making it through this intense, repetitive movement and mark and making, and the other is creating it from a sense of the context of art and making and production of art. So they're both thinking about the production of their works of art from totally different spaces. One might say that one is derived from a history of art and that art canon. The other is through creativity and the passion and drive. Not saying that Phila wasn't passionate, but the other through the need to be creative. I have this idea of putting these 2 artists' work in the same space together and not naming the artist's work and having the audience able to make their own understanding and form and conversation about the works of art with no prior judgment or understanding of who they are. This may seem simple to many in our audience here, but it might be not so simple to a general audience, the public, about what it means to be an artist who has all forms of disability. That they're making work in the same creative process as an able-bodied person. For me, this is about a judgment system of the world that we live in, this ableist kind of capitalist world that we exist within. And I often wonder nowadays if Phila, if she was alive, how she would approach it, how she would respond to Nena's work. We wouldn't ask Nena to respond to Phila, but would to Nena to respond to Phila's work. But how would Phila respond to Nena's work in the space? Nena is very performative. She uses performance in the making in the gallery space, and that's there for the public to engage with as well. I think since I started looking at Naina's work, one of the most exciting things that I have for her in knowing her practice now is that her practice is being really taken seriously by this art world. And I think it goes without saying, really, everyone here around the table will recognize how difficult that is to penetrate a system, the system that we experience that is incredibly ableist and that has directors just turn around and walk out the door and leave you on your own to deal with your own situation and context with no support. So there's many things in there, and there's many things that I'm often thinking about is how we can stop this ableist approach. How can we get leaders in our sector to listen deeply, to understand deeply, to commit to making significant change? That's me, Amanda, I think. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you, Paula. That's really very powerful what you're discussing, and some really important topics. We had quite a few comments actually, and I'll just read out a couple of those. So from Cruz has asked, I'm interested that for you, describe yourself as not being disabled, yet have experienced ableist attitudes. I struggled to admit publicly that I am autistic until I realised that by not coming out, I was myself being ableist. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, it's such a good question.
That's a big question.
I've thought about this so often. I've thought about it so hard, and I spent a lot of time. I think it's to do with the fact that there's these labels, right? And I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in that binary world of living and working. So for me, I don't see it as a disability. I've never really, I don't think, even though I find it, I find it really hard and challenging and really difficult. And maybe it is something to do with my ego. Maybe my ego is really in there somewhere. I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. And that is framed and constructed from the world I live in as well, right? There are some deep inner questions I still have about this. So thank you for asking it. But I think for me, it's about just positioning it, right? And getting other people to change their attitudes. That's the most important thing. I don't necessarily call people out, but I wish I had done at that time. That director just walked out of the door and left me to it.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll pick up on how you were treated in just a moment. But another comment from Emma Long has said that your experience resonates so much, Paula. As someone with ME, CFS, I had a statement or ableist attitude directed at me via email from a senior manager after not being able to complete work to a deadline due to sometimes incapability nature of disease. We'd just like to see more effort. And I think that as a statement, I wanted to ask you, sort of like being director for Sivan, have you seen active change? And obviously you're in that position and you yourself has experienced these really negative attitudes, but sort of fast forward to where you are present day, do you feel there has been a change in attitudes towards disability, dyslexia, neurodivergent people in general?
I think there is, by my close community, by the people that I work with very closely. But no, there's a lot of there's a lot of statements about care and how you care and how you approach these systemic barriers. The people that I work with, I trust the most, and I suppose it's really difficult for me to trust people. That's probably where I'm, you know, I you know, that is a massive barrier for me. But on majority and whole, no, I haven't. You know, it goes back to that kind of prompt in my signature on my email that I ask people to write bullet points and to form their ideas so they're highlighted if I need, you know, they need to make me aware of something. So I self-identify in that way, and I make light of it in that self-identification as well. But no, you know, I get essays, I get, you know, really bad small fonts, you know, like really, you know, difficult, you know, emails to read without being approached or, you know, asking just to meet me or, you know, talk it through because there's something, you know, difficult or tricky that we need to think, you know, talk through. And there's an extensive email with extensive information that I'm expected to be able to digest just like that.
Yeah, definitely.
I love reading, I love editing, I love all of that stuff. I'm not, you know, I'm not shy of it, but it just takes me a lot longer than, you know, majority of people, let's say.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll pull up a point in that in a second, but we've had another comment, and it says, Paula, thank you for such an honest presentation that draws upon your lived experience, and as a result makes your curatorial artistic practice inspirational, current and original. And for me, this is what today is all about. So that was a really lovely comment, just wanted to put out there. I had a couple of questions for you. In all of your experience, do you feel that there's been this element of expectation because of your role? Now, I ask that because I think everyone has different expectation impacted on them. But I just wanted to ask, you know, from your lovely, colourful career, how that's impacted you.
I don't know. I think it's the expectation I have on myself as well.
Okay.
Like I'm driven, you know, I'm, you know, that's the one thing that I kind of, you know, I am incredibly driven, and I want to succeed. I think probably what I struggle with is this sort of the falseness of the expectation that sits within the art world. And I think that's the problem that is probably the biggest issue for me, is that this sense of kind of, you know, what artists are talking about, what artists are making about isn't then taken out into the practice within the structure or the ecosystem from every level, you know, even from artist led to studios to through to, you know, institutions. There needs to be a way for the sector to be able to take on, you know, really comprehensive kind of learning. And it has changed. It has changed, but we have got a long way to go. I feel more comfortable sitting in cross art form discussions with other art forms than I do often the visual arts. I feel more comfortable being in those rooms than I do the visual arts.
Wow. And just picking up on some things that you've said there, I wanted to ask you about the comparison exhibition between Naina's work and Philippa's work, because from the images you showed, stylistically, they are very similar. But if you did have that model of exhibition where labels were completely removed and you just explored the work for what that is, what do you think the impacts of that way of working would be? We all understand labels are needed and necessary, but in this circumstance, what would what do you think the impacts would be on that?
It's about using your imagination, isn't it? I think for an audience to be able to think about what that artist is doing, to think in a way, you know, putting yourself in their shoes as an artist, what they're exploring and how they're using the materials and how they're working with them and how fast the material might have been processed or produced, or the rhythm in it, or the, you know, the structure within it. I think it's about being more, for me, you know, wishing the audience to think more reflective of that process than it is the, and that's why I love sculpture so much, is because, and that's why I made sculpture, because of its form and what it can say in a different way from, you know, painting, whatever, you know, that's my kind of interest in sculpture, I suppose. But yeah, it's about learning to look at things from a visual language that you identify it with the work of art in your own way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think having different art forms gives you the opportunity to use different types of language and interpret work in different ways that are suited for other people's needs. That's how I see it anyway. But I just wanted to ask
allowing that freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, I've described a work of art by an artist to a colleague once, and she's gone, no, it's not about that. And I'm like, oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
but
and isn't
that something entirely different there, you know?
Yeah, and isn't that a funny thing? And I think that's become quite evident in this seminar today, that interpretation and labels heavily influence how we read different artworks, how things are interpreted, from our talk earlier. And that is, I think that's the thing that may need to change going forward, with how different works are written about and how things are spoken about. When that changes, we see the work and the people possibly in a different light. That's been a really fascinating and insightful talk, Paula. What we're doing now is we're just going to have a short 10-minute break. So we'll come back at just say 3:05, and we're joining for our last speaker of the day, Christopher Samuels. So thank you, Paula, and thank you, Emily. Thank you. So welcome back, everyone. We now have Christopher Samuel. So Christopher is a multidisciplinary artist whose practice is rooted in identity and disability politics, often echoing the many facets of his own lived experience, seeking to interrogate his personal understanding of identity as a disabled person impacted by inequality and marginalisation. I'll hand over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Good afternoon, everyone. To everyone who's spoken before me, it's been amazing. Raised a lot of things for myself. And so yeah, I'm Christopher Samuel. I'm going to visually describe myself. I'm wearing a purple, pink top. I've got short hair, kind of moustache, grey beard. I'm sitting in my room with a stack of shoe boxes behind me, which is one of the perks of not being able to walk. Your shoes last forever. Right, Colin, can we go to the next? Put the slide on, please. Okay, so on the screen is a picture of a custom-built microfilm reader against a colourful backdrop of white walls with black lines and yellow and pink blocks of color. On the screen of the microphone reader is an old photo of a blue bus. The title of the work is called The Archive of the Unseen. So I want to frame my presentation based on my practice, my experience. This work was commissioned by the Work Collection, Unlimited, 2021-22. It was a response to a question I raised. Am I represented within Wellcome's archives? And I wasn't surprised. So this work is a response to that absence. I knew for the commission, I wanted to be ambitious, not only with the content, but also the way the work was presented. And so the quality of the work was important to me, to build quality, the finishing of housing, the content edited, and presented, and how it was operated, all to a high spec. Yet I have experienced in the past when work has been presented as disabled art that has changed the expectations of people, usually in a negative way. So I felt that if this work was presented in a certain way, the work could have been disregarded. The quality mattered to me because I felt it would change how people viewed it. Next slide, please. So this is another image of a gallery space exhibiting the archive with walls covered with black lines, making geogramming shapes, black line shapes, filled with yellow, pink, blue, and orange shapes. To the side of the image, it's the microphone reader. On the wall, on the walls are small framed black and pen ink drawings. And in the far corner, it's a doorway size, colorful box structure that houses the old audio for the work called Our Confessions. So this commission was quite competitive, getting it raised my profile and opened up new opportunities that helped me to make new connections. It felt like a success getting it. When I think of a successful artist with a quality practice, I think, first of all, deep thinker, creative new ideas, questioning, challenging, great communicator, slick in delivery of work, broad network of people around them, shows work in the right spaces at the right time, trend center, and then the practical stuff, hard worker, over the numbers, knows who to network with, shrewd mover, positions themselves strategically as sellable. But again, that raised the question for me, what aspects of that changes if you are disabled? So traditionally, some of those aspects of what we think of as a quality art practice can create barriers, as we know. Working 14 hours a day in your studio, traveling to exhibition openings every week, being able to speak publicly about your work, networking, building a visual social media presence, traveling. If you have a disability, some of those things become much harder to do or access or actually impossible to do. And potentially they're more expensive, creating financial barriers. If additional costs to travel to things, you need to produce things like things for fabricators, BSL interpreters, finding accessible studio space, etc. Some disabled people, like myself, have less energy, time, or support. I have support to spend on work activities because of other aspects of their life, which can lead to their choices or opportunities, and which means that they can't capitalize on some opportunities, and many opportunities are not made as accessible offerings in the first place, which means that we miss out. If you have less time, money, or resources to spend creating, it's really hard, I found, not to let that impact the quality of the work you make or how you get your work out there. I think, as we all know, better financial support, longer lead times to apply or complete projects, are more flexible ways of accessing opportunities would help support disabled artists to create work or even a work of a higher standard. Next slide, please. So on the screen is two images from a film I co-created with the Research Centre for Museum and Galleries in Leicester and the National Trust last year. This film was called Everywhere Nowhere. The top image, it's an image of myself wearing a hoodie, being filmed in a stately home. So the right of me, or to the left of me, and right of the screen, overlaid on my image is a BSL interpreter wearing a dark blue t-shirt. The second image is 17th century painting of Queen Henrietta Marie and Sir Geoffrey Hudson, known as the Queen's Dwarf. And there's also BSL interpreter overlaid on the top of the image. Everywhere Nowhere was a research project trying to uncover little or unknown stories of disabled people throughout history. And it resulted in this film of 10 stories about historical disabled people with connections to the National Trust. This project, like the Archive of the Unseen, was this project, like the Archive of the Unseen, was a response to an absence. I suppose the disabled art world still needs films, still feels not integrated into the mainstream. Work by disabled artists, I feel needs to be shown and spoken about in more places to normalize conversations. I personally feel as well, integration and visibility builds resilience and shared learning. Segregation, I feel, leads to a lack of contact between disabled and non-disabled people, leading to misunderstanding, incorrect preconceptions, and a fear of otherness. Inclusion is not about dropping standards. It's about including a more diverse range of artists from the outset and normalizing their presence in art spaces, not just as artists, but throughout organization, inside out and outside in. A more diverse and rich cultural sector bleeds into the rest of society. So again, not seeing yourself represented makes you feel, seeing yourself represented makes you feel represented and more part of society and a cultural sector. It also changes society's expectations of people with disabilities, when disabled people are seen as succeeding in different sectors and not in a oh, aren't they wonderful, we should be proud of, we should be proud kind of way. We have skills that should be used. Next slide, please. So on the screen, it's a photograph of a hotel room with a large bread in the center, which is raised at waist height. This is a photo from a hotel room which I created, called The Welcome Inn, and Airbnb at an Airbnb in Blackpool in 2019. I was one of few artists commissioned to design a functioning hotel room for the public to book nights in. I created an inaccessible hotel room to challenge the one-size-fits-all culture and highlight the social model of disability in practice. This work got picked up by the media nationally and internationally and was dubbed the worst hotel room to stay in, which made me laugh. It was treated like a joke, which I knew it would have that effect because I designed it. It looks theatrical and humorous, but one guest who stayed in the room said one line in an inaccessible hotel room is hilarious. 2 nights become slightly less hilarious and more frustrating, but a whole lifetime of inaccessible rooms become understood at a whole new level. I think my work critiqued and written about in the mainstream media and art media is one way that quality is judged, and artists gain more attention and become more validated. Today, this work is one of my only pieces that gained a lot of press attention and still wasn't reviewed critically or written about within our world, which speaks volumes. This is a serious lack of critical writing around disabled artists' work. But again, what are the roots in that of that? Is there a fear to critique the work because critics feel the lack, they feel they lack the correct knowledge or language, or fear of offending. I think it's all of those. Or is it because work by disabled artists is not seen as worth critiquing, either because perceived as lack of quality, or because it's seen as other, or for a niche audience? Again, integration would help to normalize the conversation and raise the profile of disabled artists to be seen as having the same value and place as other work. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide. On the screen is a black and white drawing in ink, and it's titled The Days I Never Died. It's an image of a man with a skull for a head sitting up in a silhouette of himself. He is staring out at the view. Around him is a wooden floor with bags filled with boxes. Making quality work is important for me. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is how quality is judged differently for different art practices. This is an ongoing connection between the work by disabled artists and the expectation of poor work, poor exhibition spaces, poor presentation. Because I think historically that was often true and still is to some degree, because those artists lacked financial resources and sector support. There is still a culture of pity, I feel. Oh wow, how did they do that? Well done them. The lack of aspiration connected to disabled artists. Sorry. Outsider art is an interesting example of a non-mainstream part of the world, our world, that is now globally recognized and is in many collections. It has become sellable, collectible, because it is a defined genre of art that has been written about and validated by the system. And we're seeing this. But it is still judged, I feel, differently to the rest of able-bodied art, and by different sets of standards. And this still cannot command the same and still can't command the same prices as other contemporary genres. What would disabled artists need to reach to have the same standards or go beyond that? How do we make art by disabled people desirable, marketable, and valid, so it's picked up and championed equally within our world? I'm not sure how sellable I am, to a degree. Often, the more disabled you are, the less marketable you are. There's an unwritten hierarchy of disability in society. I know from my own condition as it's progressed and seeing how people's attitudes shift towards me. And what happens if work is shown without a label, like we've heard? How does it change? How does it changes how its quality is judged? For some people, having the disabled label is very important. For others, not. And that's down to preference. I want to see art by disabled artists shown, collected, written about by major galleries, names alongside non-disabled counterparts. The sector needs that sector validation and visibility would increase the expectations, perceptions of disabled art, and therefore perceives quality and value automatically increases. And again, the aim is to shift society's expectation. Yeah, so that's my bit. I hope everyone could hear me.
Hi, Chris. That was really great and very insightful into your practice, and we really appreciate you speaking on that. We've had some really interesting comments, and I'll just go through a couple of them with you if that's okay. So from Tom Campbell, fascinating points here on the lack of critical writing on disabled artists. I'd add that dominant aesthetic values of which art theory and art history are a part are inherently disableist. I would perhaps even say complicate the aesthetic invalidation of disabled people. And we've spoken about critical writing quite extensively between us about are there any art critics that focused predominantly on disabled art practice? And we couldn't really come up with much. Yeah. Following on from that comment, a comment from Mike Laywood says, Chris, you are so right about critical writing. I have seen more writing in Art Monthly by Hannah Wallace on disabled artists, but still so little. We need organisers of projects to include fees for critical writing that can be used for articles, etc. And on that point, I just wanted to pick your brain a bit about your own work and practice. And as you mentioned, with the welcome in, the sentence you referred to was the world's worst place to stay. Was there any other critical examination of that body of work, or have you had your own work reviewed personally?
No, not that piece of work. Not that piece of work. I think I did the thing you shouldn't do. So Daily Mail wrote an article on it. And they're one of the ones that dubbed it. But I read the comments of the readers online. And there's some really disheartening comments, but someone said, oh, is this what they're funding for now? Funding people to make rooms that are inaccessible. But a lady commented after that saying her daughter is disabled, and when she goes to hotel rooms, she can't sleep in the bed, she can't access the toilet, and he would think about it differently if he couldn't use the bed or use the toilet. But going back to the point about critical writing, there isn't. There's some brilliant artists out there, disabled artists, making powerful pieces of work, and I'm baffled. I'm like, okay, so is it the galleries? Is it the institutions that are not putting things in place? Because I'm sure they've got connections with critics, the press, to pick up and promote the work. But I'm not seeing this happen, which is quite, it's not great. It's not great. But
yeah. No, I definitely agree. And following on from that, we've got a comment from Liz saying, in the face of everything you're saying, Chris, about quality and critique, do you have any comments on how we as artists can gain or retain a sense of quality within our own work? For example, how do we keep making in the face of the sidelining? How do we, in commas, know whether we're any good? So it's a big question for you there.
I think you need to be confident, first of all. I think when I went to uni, before I even went to uni, and going back to Claire's point about teachers or lecturers, my lecturer prepared me. She said, you'll be going to uni. They might try and shift you in terms of your subject matter. They might have an in-house style. But I say that to say this. I knew what I wanted to make work about, but I wasn't making work about disability at that time. I still didn't really identify fully as a disabled artist that makes work about disability. But what I had what advantage I had was my whole life I'd been fighting and thinking ahead. Whereas a lot of people who are able-bodied, they don't have to plan their day or how they're going to interact or how they're going to be seen. I was way ahead of my peers before I left uni. Like a lecturer said, a lot of you are not going to get a first. I said, okay, let's hear about that.
Yeah.
I say that to say this. I made sure I was tapped into a network of people around me. So where I lived, what are the galleries, what are the community that I could lean into? So I started looking at Shape, Unlimited, Disability Online, Dash, tapping into outside and in. I made loads of connections, but I knew in order for me to practice as an artist, I needed, because I'm dyslexic, and I've got a weird relationship with education, which is not very pleasant. But I knew I needed someone who could write applications for me to get funding. I knew I needed access and support. I knew that I could only work a certain amount of hours. No one showed me how to navigate the benefit system wise, receiving funding, all of these things. I had to figure out myself, but that was due to being confident, but also forward thinking. I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. Thank you. And you've picked up some really interesting points there. And I just wanted to reflect back on, you spoke about obviously the Everywhere and Nowhere project that looked at historical work. What do you think the importance is? Obviously, Alice that's a big part of her research from Tate. That's what she's looking into as well. And what do you think the importance is of going back through history and pulling out these stories about different disabled artists or figures that were around at the time?
So I think first off, we're not getting younger, none of us, and we're at risk of missing these stories, not having them being framed, right? I think that's quite important. I think, and not to shy away from it. I think Alice she asked all the right questions: how, what, and who, and that's the main. That's a big step. Like for instance, research center for museum studies. I was part of a steering panel, and we help shape and create an ethical framework for like collections and institutions to use. So it'd be good to connect in that way. So that looks at how to contextualize things properly. What is the ethical language? How to, if there's not enough information based on an object, how you go about navigating that. But again, I think the important thing here is do not speak for disabled people. That's where mistakes are had. I think having conversations is the best way with professionals. There's a lot of experts, activists, advocates, artists within the sector who are not just artists that you can lean on.
Yeah. And again, you yourself have shown extensively with your work, and I like the fact that you mentioned about the work, your early work is focusing on not your health, but your later work does. And my question is, have you been shown in group exhibitions? Are they the group exhibitions you have been shown in, are they just aimed at people with disabilities, or are they mixed shows? And the reason I asked that is because I love the phrase that you use, which was normalizing their presence. So has that ever been represented?
So I think yes, I have once or twice, but that's I've still stayed true to my kind of response to a subject. But I think it's hard for me to answer that question. It's not hard. I identify as a disabled artist. I know that I make work and I'm about disability. So the people that I partner with are disability focused or led. They want to show work by people with disabilities that make work about a certain topic. And that's okay. So I think my point is the other galleries, the other organizations that are not showing work. And it needs to be part of their program. It doesn't need to be a bolt-on or how can I put it? In a kind of like you get these creative rooms in a gallery where you see some work by disabled people. I think we're starting to move away from that, but it still feels like an afterthought. So I think it's programming.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for your response to that. I just want to flick back to the comments very quickly. And we've got Claire Penkeith that says, thanks so much, Chris, for this emphasis of interdependence and importance of community. So much suggests independence is key, but the way you described these relationships was beautifully expressed and moving. It's a really nice comment. Thank you, Claire. And I just had one last sort of point, and if anyone else has any questions for Chris, please do put them in the chat, because this will be the roundup now. So if there's any other questions, please do put them in the chat. The last question I had for you, Chris, which you've already spoken of, was what does quality art practice mean to you in very simple, short terms for you personally? Tough question, I'm sorry.
No, I think it's support from organizations or galleries, but a solid network of people around you can enable you to work at your best and and being true to yourself and brave.
I love that. So just to, I'm just scanning the chat. I can't see any more questions, but I just think it would be lovely to round off with what Chris has just said. And it's not just about what you make, it's who you work with, and that has a massive impact. I just think that was just brilliant. So thank you so much, Chris, for your time. Thank you to Emily and Ali as well for doing the interpretation for Christopher's talk. So were there any other questions at all for today's panel? I'm just scanning the comments. If Colin would like to jump back on and we could see Joanne and Ali, that would be great. Right, well, I can't see any other direct questions or comments, so yes, I'll wrap up. So I'd just like to again thank all of the panel for today's seminar. This has been extremely insightful and absolutely fascinating. I hope from today that you can go away and with more questions than you have answers, and have at least started a conversation on the judgment around quality within arts practice. So I'd just like to go on to say a huge thank you to Emily and to Ali for your BSL interpretation today. Thank you to Joanne and Colin for assisting within the Zoom today. And thank you to BAN, the British Art Network, for funding this seminar. And a huge thank you to everyone who has joined today. The recording of the event will be available within the next few weeks and will be mailed to those who have joined today. If you have any other questions or would like to get in contact with me personally, feel free to email me at amandalynchart@gmail.com. So I've just added in a survey link here, and if you can, it's very, very short, only 5 questions. If you could fill this in, it would be really great to get some of your feedback for today's session and have any other comments and responses that you may have. I'd be extremely grateful for this if you could. So thank you so much. Over to Colin and Joanne if you had any closing comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. It's been a very interesting and insightful seminar. I don't know. I thought there was a very interesting kind of comment from Jew Gosling that kind of, in a way, it sort of sums up the questions that I think this seminar proposes. She said, do we want the art world to start to judge us by their standards, inverted commas, properly, or do we want the art world to adopt our standards instead? Do we want to spend more time showing our work in elitist, inaccessible spaces, or bring more art out into the community? What does being a radical art movement mean? And I'll leave you with that thought.
Brilliant. Well, thanks again to everyone that's joined today, and thank you to all of the panel. And again, a huge thank you to Emily and Ali. It's lovely to have you here today. Take care.